Dear soul, there is something heaven has been waiting for the right moment to reveal to you. Not because the truth was uncertain, not because the timing was unclear, but because there are certain revelations so profound, so deeply life-altering, so spiritually significant, that they must arrive at exactly the right moment in order to land with their full weight and their full meaning. Heaven understands timing in ways the human mind cannot fully comprehend. Heaven sees the entire map of a life while we are standing at a single crossroads, uncertain which direction to take, unsure whether we are even on the right road at all. And so heaven waits. Heaven prepares. Heaven arranges. And then, when the season has finally ripened and the soul is finally ready to receive what has been prepared for it, heaven speaks. This is that moment. This is heaven speaking directly to you. For a long time, your soulmate kept their feelings about you hidden deep within their heart. Not on the surface where feelings are easy to dismiss or explain away, but in that deep, quiet, sacred interior place where the truest and most undeniable emotions live. They questioned those feelings. They sat with them in the silence of their private moments and turned them over and over, examining them from every angle, searching for a rational explanation. They analyzed them the way someone analyzes something they are afraid to trust because the feeling is simply too large, too overwhelming, too incomprehensible to accept without resistance. They even tried to dismiss them altogether, to pack them away into a corner of their heart and pretend they did not exist, pretend they had not taken root, pretend that the strange, powerful, unexplainable pull they felt toward you was something temporary or something ordinary that would eventually fade like morning fog once the sun rose high enough. But it never faded. No matter how much time passed, no matter how many distractions they surrounded themselves with, no matter how determinedly they tried to redirect their attention, the feeling remained. In fact, it did not simply remain. It grew. It deepened. It became something that could no longer be contained in silence, something that had outgrown the private chambers of the heart and needed to be spoken aloud, needed to be examined in the light of another person's perspective, needed to be released from the confinement of solitary thought into the open air of honest conversation. And so your soulmate opened up, not to just anyone, not to a friend who might misunderstand, not to an acquaintance who might reduce something sacred to something trivial with a careless word or an indifferent shrug. They opened up to their mother. Because when something matters deeply to us, when something touches the core of who we are and reaches into the spiritual territory of our destiny, we instinctively seek the counsel of those who have known us the longest, those who have watched us grow, those who carry within themselves a kind of wisdom that only years of living, loving, losing, and learning can produce. At first, it seemed like an ordinary conversation. Just a few words exchanged across the familiar space of a family home. Nothing unusual in the atmosphere. Nothing dramatic in the way it began. Just two people talking, the way people who love each other always talk, without ceremony, without formality, without any awareness of what heaven was quietly arranging in the background. They did not know, as the conversation began, that it had already been appointed. They did not realize, as the first words were spoken, that something sacred had already been set into motion long before either of them sat down together. Heaven had already begun moving behind the scenes, rearranging circumstances, positioning hearts, preparing a moment that would carry far more weight than either of them could initially see. Your soulmate spoke carefully at first, testing the words, finding the language to describe something that does not easily translate into language, because you cannot fully explain a spiritual connection using ordinary vocabulary. You cannot use the same words you would use to describe a passing fancy or a surface-level attraction when what you are actually trying to describe is something that reaches into the very fabric of who you are. something that feels ancient and familiar, something that feels less like a beginning and more like a recognition, like meeting someone you have somehow always known, even when all logic insists that you have only recently encountered them. Their mother listened carefully. She did not rush. She did not interrupt. She did not offer quick conclusions or easy answers. She simply listened the way a wise person listens, with complete attention, with unhurried patience, with the kind of quiet presence that creates space for truth to emerge fully formed rather than forcing it out before it is ready. She listened to the details your soulmate shared. She listened to the stories, the small moments, the seemingly insignificant encounters that somehow carried enormous weight in the retelling of them. She listened to the emotions woven through every sentence. But most importantly, she listened to something beyond the words themselves. She listened to the frequency, the energy, the unmistakable spiritual signature of what was being described. And then something shifted. Something within her spirit stirred in a way she had not expected. It was not an intellectual reaction. It was not a logical conclusion drawn from evidence presented. It was something far deeper than that. Something older. Something that resided not in the thinking mind but in that ancient, knowing place within the human soul where truth is recognized before it is understood. It was as if a hidden memory had been suddenly awakened. As if something that had been resting quietly in the depths of her spiritual awareness had been gently nudged into full consciousness by the words she was hearing. As if heaven itself had leaned close and whispered something directly into the center of her soul. Then, without warning, without premeditation, without any deliberate intention to say something extraordinary, she raised her voice and exclaimed with a certainty that surprised even herself, "You are not an ordinary soul. You were sent by heaven." The room fell silent. Not the silence of emptiness. Not the silence of awkwardness. But the silence of recognition. The silence that falls over a space when something true and irreversible has been spoken aloud, when words have landed so precisely and with such undeniable accuracy that the atmosphere itself seems to pause in acknowledgement. Your soulmate was stunned. They sat with those words and felt them echoing through layers of thought and feeling, reaching places they had not expected words to reach. Those words seemed impossible in one sense. They seemed far too large, far too sacred, far too specific to be spoken in such an ordinary moment, in such a familiar setting, by someone who had simply been listening to a conversation about feelings. Yet the deeper your soulmate thought about them, the more those words did not seem impossible at all. The more they thought about them, the more those words seemed like the only words that could have possibly captured what had been so difficult to describe. The more they sat with them, the more they began to make a kind of sense that transcended ordinary understanding. Because there has always been something different about you. Not different in the way that makes you strange or out of place. Not different in a way that alienates or confuses. But different in a way that is undeniably felt by those who encounter you, even when they lack the vocabulary to name what they are feeling. People sense it the moment they step into your presence. They feel it even when they cannot explain it. They know that something about you is not quite like what they have encountered before, that something about the atmosphere shifts in ways both subtle and significant when you are in the room. Your presence changes things. Not because you announce yourself dramatically or because you perform for the benefit of others or because you work to create a particular impression, but because you carry something within you that is simply, quietly, powerfully real. Something that radiates without effort. Something that touches people before a single word is spoken. You walk into a room and the atmosphere changes. People who were closed begin to open. People who were tense begin to relax. People who were isolated begin to feel, almost against their will, that they are not entirely alone. You speak a few words and somehow people feel genuinely heard and understood in a way they rarely experience. Not because you are performing the role of a good listener, not because you are following a script of kindness, but because you actually care, because your heart is genuinely present in your interactions, because when you pay attention to someone, your attention is real. And people feel the difference between real attention and the performance of attention immediately, even when they cannot articulate why one feels so different from the other. You offer kindness and hearts begin to heal in ways that surprise even those who are healing. You have watched people walk away from a brief encounter with you carrying something lighter than what they brought into it. You have been thanked for things you barely remember doing, for small gestures that seemed insignificant to you but that meant everything to someone else. You have been told, more times than perhaps you have fully absorbed, that something you said or did at a particular moment made a difference that changed the entire direction of someone's thinking, someone's feeling, someone's life. You survived battles that should have broken you. This is perhaps one of the most striking things about you, and one of the things that heaven holds with particular tenderness when it looks at your journey. The things you have walked through, the weight you have carried, the storms that came one after another without what felt like adequate time to recover in between. There were seasons in your life when the pressure was so relentless, so unceasing, so multidirectional that simply continuing to breathe felt like an act of extraordinary courage. And yet you continued. Not always gracefully, not always without stumbling, not always without tears or doubt or the desperate wish that someone would simply give you a moment of peace. But you continued. You carried burdens that would have crushed people of lesser spiritual constitution. You absorbed grief that would have hollowed others out completely. You endured disappointment after disappointment without allowing disappointment to become the permanent lens through which you view the world. And still, you continue forward. What many people do not realize is that heaven often hides its greatest blessings behind ordinary appearances. The brightest lights in the universe do not always announce themselves with fanfare and spectacle. Sometimes they arrive wrapped in the most unremarkable packaging. Sometimes they sit quietly in corners while louder, more promotional presences fill the room with noise and color, and nobody notices that the truest light in the space is coming from the one who has made no effort to be noticed. Heaven understands something about the nature of genuine spiritual power that human culture often gets entirely backwards. Human culture tends to celebrate what is loud, what is visible, what is dramatic, what demands attention. Heaven celebrates what is faithful, what is genuine, what remains steadfast when no one is watching, what continues to carry love in its hands even when love has not been returned in kind. The most powerful spiritual gifts are often hidden beneath humility, not a performed humility, not the kind of false modesty that is actually a more sophisticated form of seeking attention, but a genuine, uncalculated humility that comes from being so fully focused on purpose that personal recognition simply is not the primary concern. The strongest spiritual warriors, the ones heaven has assigned to carry the most significant missions, frequently look like ordinary people to the undiscerning eye. They look like your neighbor. They look like the quiet person in the back of the room. They look like someone who has been through too much and survived anyway and somehow, mysteriously, emerged from the experience not bitter but deeper, not closed but more open, not diminished but expanded. This is why so many have misunderstood you throughout the years. They were trying to see you with eyes calibrated to ordinary measurements. They were using the standard metrics of success and significance, the external markers that culture uses to assign value to human beings, and you have never fit neatly into those categories. You have never been the person who can be easily reduced to a simple description or placed in a convenient box or understood entirely through a surface-level observation. And because you could not be easily categorized, Some people chose confusion over curiosity. Some people chose dismissal over the harder work of genuine understanding. Some people grew uncomfortable with the complexity of you, with the depth that kept revealing itself the longer they paid attention, and rather than lean into that discomfort and allow it to expand them, they stepped back. This is why people have underestimated you. They saw one dimension and assumed they had seen the whole. They encountered your quietness and mistook it for emptiness. They observed your patience and mistook it for passivity. They witnessed your gentleness and mistook it for weakness. They saw that you did not fight for recognition and concluded, erroneously, that recognition was not yours to have. They saw you absorb difficulty without collapse and assumed, wrongly, that the difficulty was not difficult at all, that you were simply someone to whom hardship came easily. What they could not see was what was happening beneath the surface. What they could not perceive was the extraordinary spiritual architecture that allowed you to remain standing when everything around you was designed to bring you down. This is why some have walked away only to later realize what they lost. Because they walked away from something they did not fully understand, and understanding only arrived after the distance had grown. After enough time had passed, after enough contrast had been experienced with what came after, they began to see with greater clarity what had been present all along. They began to reconstruct the moments they had dismissed. They began to reconsider the interactions they had taken for granted. And something settled over them, not quite regret, not quite grief, but a particular kind of recognition that arrives too late to do anything except teach a lesson about paying closer attention in the future. You were never meant to blend in with the crowd. This was never your assignment. You were never created to follow the path everyone else follows simply because it is the path that has already been cleared and mapped and made comfortable by those who came before. There is a reason that path has always felt vaguely wrong to you, even when you could not name the wrongness, even when you tried your best to want what everyone around you seemed to want without difficulty. There is a reason you have always felt, somewhere beneath the surface of your daily existence, a pulling in a different direction, a calling toward something that had not yet been fully revealed, a sense of mission that exceeded the ordinary definitions of a successful life. Long before you were born, heaven knew your name. Not the name written on your birth certificate, though that name too is known, but the name written in spiritual reality, the name that corresponds to your assignment. The name that was written when the purpose of your life was first conceived in the mind of the divine. Before you drew your first breath, your purpose was already inscribed. Before you took your first step, the territory of your journey had already been mapped. Before you spoke your first word, heaven had already ensured that the people, the experiences, and the encounters that would be necessary for the fulfillment of your purpose would be arranged along the road ahead of you. Before your first step, angels had already been assigned to watch over your journey. Not angels in the popular cultural imagination of winged beings in white robes, though perhaps that imagery touches something real, but presences, guardians, spiritual forces dedicated to the preservation and the guidance of your path. Forces that intervened in ways you will never fully know on this side of eternity. Situations that were deflected before you ever became aware they were approaching. Dangers that were redirected. Opportunities that were protected until you arrived at the moment when you were prepared to receive them. You have been traveling with an invisible convoy that has never once abandoned its post, not during the darkest nights, not during the most silent seasons, not during the moments when you felt most deeply and most completely alone. Many times you wondered why your life felt different from the lives of those around you. Why the rhythm of your experience did not match the rhythm of what seemed to come easily and naturally to others. Why the things that seemed simple for other people felt complicated for you. Why certain doors that opened effortlessly for others remained inexplicably closed when you stood before them. Why your journey seemed longer, more winding, more full of unexpected complications and detours than you ever anticipated it would be when you imagined your future in its earliest and most hopeful forms. Many times you questioned why certain challenges appeared again and again, as if the universe was determined to teach you something you could not yet see, as if the same lesson kept arriving in new packaging until you finally absorbed it at a depth that would sustain you for everything that lay ahead. Many times you asked why doors closed when you desperately wanted them to open, why certain opportunities seemed to disappear at the last moment, why certain relationships ended before you were ready for them to end, why certain dreams seemed to dissolve just when they appeared to be finally coming within reach. In those moments, the silence that answered your questions felt less like peace and more like absence, less like trust and more like abandonment. What you could not see was that heaven was protecting a future that had not yet arrived. What you could not perceive in those moments of confusion and grief and quiet desperation was that the closing of one door was not a judgment against your worth or your capability or your readiness. It was a navigation. It was heaven steering your life away from what would have ultimately limited you and toward what would ultimately fulfill you. Every delay had meaning, even the delays that brought tears. Every disappointment carried purpose, even the disappointments that took years to process. Every setback was preparing you for something greater, building within you the very qualities that the greater thing would require. The depth of character, the resilience of spirit, the hard-won wisdom that only genuine struggle can produce in genuine proportions. The reason people have difficulty understanding you is because they are trying to measure a spiritual assignment using ordinary eyes and ordinary instruments of evaluation. And that approach will always fall short. You cannot assess the significance of something sacred using metrics designed for something secular. You cannot weigh what is eternal using scales calibrated for what is temporary. You cannot see the full scope of a life that has been marked by heaven by looking only at its surface appearances, its visible achievements, its external circumstances. To truly understand a life like yours requires a different kind of seeing. The kind of seeing that goes beneath the visible. The kind of seeing that perceives not merely what is present but what is in the process of becoming. The kind of seeing that recognizes destiny in the making before it arrives in its finished form. Your soul carries something rare. Something that was not distributed widely because it was intended for a specific and significant purpose. Something sacred that has been entrusted to you not because you are perfect, not because you have never made mistakes, not because your path has been free of stumbling, but because heaven knew something about your nature that qualified you for this carrying. Something about your capacity to remain tender even after being hurt. Something about your insistence on continuing to love even when love has been costly. Something about the way you refuse, even in your most discouraged moments, to abandon your belief that goodness is real and that kindness matters and that the effort to do right is always worth the energy it requires. Something heaven intentionally concealed until the proper season. Because there are gifts that must be prepared before they can be revealed. Because there are callings that must be quietly cultivated in the hidden ground of private experience before they can be displayed in the open air of public purpose. Because the most significant fruit does not ripen overnight. It develops over seasons. It requires the full experience of sun and rain, of warmth and cold, of abundance and scarcity, before it arrives at the fullness of what it was always meant to be. The mother sensed this immediately, not because she possesses supernatural abilities that exceed those of ordinary human beings, not because she had been given advance information about you or advance knowledge of your life or your struggles or your story. But because spirit recognizes spirit in a way that bypasses the need for information or evidence. Because the deepest knowing is not cognitive. It is not constructed from data. It arrives whole, instantly, with a certainty that feels ancient rather than acquired. Her soul recognized something within you that words could barely begin to describe. A quality of light that is distinguishable even when it cannot be named. A spiritual signature so specific and so unmistakable that once you have perceived it, you cannot unfeel the recognition, cannot unsee what you have seen. A calling that extends beyond the personal and reaches into something collective. Something that is not only about your own flourishing but about the flourishing of others. Something that has been given to you not for safekeeping alone but for sharing. Not for your private benefit alone but for the benefit of those whose lives will be touched by yours, some of whom you have already encountered and some of whom you have not yet met but who are already, even now, being moved along paths that will eventually intersect with yours. A divine fingerprint. The unmistakable mark of heaven's intentionality. The evidence that your existence is not accidental. That you are not here as the result of random chance operating in a universe without meaning or design. That you were placed here, in this time, in this form, with these specific experiences and these specific gifts and these specific wounds and these specific capacities, with deliberate precision. That your life is not happening to you. That in the deepest sense, your life is happening through you, as an expression of something that precedes you and extends beyond you and carries a significance that you are only beginning to fully perceive. And that is why the mother's reaction was so powerful, so immediate, so unhesitating. She was not reacting to the person the world has sometimes reduced you to in its most limited and most superficial assessments of who you are. She was not reacting to your past mistakes or your present struggles or the places where you are still growing and still healing and still becoming. She was reacting to the essential truth of who you are at the deepest level of your spiritual reality. She was reacting to who heaven knows you are, has always known you are, and has never once doubted you are, even in the seasons when you doubted it yourself most profoundly. For years, you may have felt overlooked, passed over, invisible in a way that was difficult to articulate because you did not want to appear to be seeking attention, did not want to seem as though your primary concern was recognition rather than purpose. But the feeling of invisibility is real and it is painful in a way that is hard to share, because it touches something foundational in the human experience. We were made for recognition, not the shallow recognition of applause and public acclaim, but the deep recognition of being truly seen by someone who perceives what is real and genuine and significant about who we are and what we carry. You may have felt forgotten, not by everyone. Not in every moment, but in the specific and particular way that someone feels forgotten when they have poured themselves into something, into people, into relationships, into work, into prayer, into silent effort that no one witnessed, and received back something far less than what they gave. In the way that someone feels forgotten when they look around at the lives of others and it appears that what they themselves have hoped for and worked toward and believed in has been awarded to those who did not hope as long or work as hard or believe as faithfully. That particular species of feeling forgotten is one of the most quietly devastating experiences a human soul can navigate, because it raises the question that heaven most wants to answer with clarity and with love. Does any of this matter? Am I seen? Am I known? Does my life carry the significance that I have always hoped it carries? You may have felt like your efforts went unnoticed. The efforts that happened in private. The efforts that cost you more than anyone knew. The efforts that you made not because you expected a reward but because something in your nature compelled you toward them. The kindnesses extended to people who never thanked you. The prayers offered for situations that resolved without anyone knowing you had been praying. The steady, faithful, unglamorous work of simply continuing to show up, continuing to try, continuing to choose love and decency and integrity even when none of those choices made the surface of your life look any more successful or comfortable or celebrated. But heaven has never lost sight of you. Not for a single day in the entire history of your existence. Not for a single moment in the entire length of your journey. Every tear that fell in private was counted and recorded and held with extraordinary tenderness by a presence that finds the tears of faithful souls to be among the most sacred things in creation. Every prayer that rose from your lips or from the depths of your heart where words could not reach was heard, not just passively received but actively answered, even when the answer did not arrive in the form you anticipated or within the timeline you hoped for. Every sleepless night during which you lay in the dark and wrestled with fear or grief or uncertainty or longing was witnessed by the same presence that never sleeps. The presence that watches over those it has marked for purpose with a care so thorough and so consistent that not a single moment of their experience escapes its attention. Even during seasons when you felt most profoundly alone, when the silence around you seemed absolute, when the distance between you and everything that felt like connection seemed impossible to close, you were surrounded by protection you could not see and by love you could not feel, but that was nevertheless completely and unconditionally present. There were battles taking place in the invisible territory around you that heaven fought on your behalf without your knowledge and without requiring your participation. Battles for your peace. Battles for your future. Battles for the preservation of what you were still becoming against forces that would have been content to see you diminished or derailed or destroyed. You did not fight those battles because you were not meant to. They were not yours to fight. They were being handled by something far greater than you on your behalf, and the evidence of their outcomes is the simple, extraordinary fact that you are still here. There were opportunities that were deliberately delayed because the timing was not yet right, because you had not yet developed the specific qualities that those opportunities would require of you in order to receive them fully and steward them faithfully, because the soil of your life had not yet been prepared deeply enough to support the roots of what those opportunities would plant, because heaven, which sees all timelines simultaneously, could perceive that an earlier arrival would have resulted in an experience you were not yet equipped to fully inhabit. And so it waited. And you waited, often without knowing what you were waiting for, often without knowing that waiting was the most spiritually productive thing you could possibly be doing in that season. There were people removed from your path not because you were unloved or because you were unworthy of connection but because they could not accompany you into your next chapter. Because the version of you that your next chapter requires is one that those people, at that particular stage of their own development, would have made more difficult to become. Because love, real love, the kind heaven specializes in, is not merely sentimental. It is strategic. It makes the hard choices on behalf of the larger good, even when those choices produce temporary pain. It clears the path not to punish but to prepare, not to diminish but to protect. And now a revelation is approaching, not the kind of revelation that arrives with dramatic external announcements or sudden visible transformations that everyone around you will immediately perceive, but a revelation that begins in the interior, in that deep and sacred place where truth settles and where understanding finally arrives in its completeness. A season of uncovering. A season when the layers that have concealed the fullness of your purpose begin to fall away one by one. A season when the things that were hidden, both about you and for you, begin to surface with a clarity and a certainty that leaves no room for the old doubts and the old fears and the old narratives of unworthiness that have sometimes whispered to you in your most vulnerable moments. A season of recognition. Not recognition in the shallow sense of fame or celebrity or social validation, but recognition in the truest sense of the word. Recognition. Knowing again. Seeing again. The arrival of a moment when what has always been true about you is finally, fully, undeniably apparent to those who have eyes to see and hearts open enough to receive it. A season when people who have been in your presence and not fully understood what they were encountering begin to understand. When those who observed you from a distance and formed incomplete conclusions begin to revise those conclusions in light of what they are now able to see. A season when truths that were hidden begin to surface. Truths about your value. Truths about your impact. Truths about the invisible difference you have made in the lives of people who will, in this approaching season, begin to tell you what you have meant to them. Truths about the prayers that were answered on your behalf. Truths about the interventions that occurred in your favor. Truths about the plan that has been unfolding all along, even in the seasons when the unfolding was invisible to you. A season when people finally begin to see, with the clarity of proper timing, what heaven saw all along when it looked at your life and found it significant. You are far more special than anyone currently realizes. Not because you are perfect. Perfection is not the standard heaven uses. Perfection is a human construction, a brittle and ultimately impossible ideal that prevents people from receiving the grace that is always already available to them. Not because you are superior to other souls, because the economy of heaven does not operate on competition or hierarchy in the way human systems do. Every soul matters. Every life is precious. Every person carries a purpose that is uniquely and specifically theirs. But your particular configuration of gifts, wounds, experiences, capacities, and calling creates something that is genuinely rare. Something that the world genuinely needs. Something that, when it finally arrives in its fullness and is allowed to express itself without apology and without the constriction of other people's limited expectations, will create waves of change in directions you cannot yet predict. Because your life carries a purpose that reaches beyond yourself, beyond your own happiness, though your happiness matters, beyond your own success, though your flourishing is desired and intended. Beyond your own comfort and security and peace, though all of these things are part of what is being prepared for you, your purpose reaches into other lives, into the lives of people who are currently sitting in their own seasons of confusion and doubt, who are currently carrying their own burdens without the benefit of someone who truly understands, who are currently searching for evidence that their own struggling and surviving and continuing to believe is worthwhile. And you are being prepared to be, for some of them, exactly the evidence they need. You were marked by heaven for a sacred purpose before you were old enough to understand what marking or heaven or purpose even meant. A purpose that will touch lives you have never met. People whose names you do not yet know, who are living in places you have not yet been, who are in the early chapters of experiences that you have already navigated and survived and whose navigation and survival qualify you to offer something to them that nothing else could provide. Not advice from a textbook, not sympathy from a safe distance, but the irreplaceable understanding of someone who has been through the territory, who knows what it feels like from the inside, who can sit with another person in the middle of it and say, without performing, without pretending, without constructing a comfort that is hollow at its center, I know this place. I have been here, and I can tell you with the certainty of someone who emerged from it that there is life on the other side, a purpose that will create changes you cannot yet imagine. Because purpose, when it is genuinely heaven, assigned in heaven, fueled, does not operate at the scale of human imagination. It exceeds it. It surprises it. It arrives in forms and produces results that the person carrying the purpose could not have designed for themselves even with the most ambitious and hopeful version of their own dreaming. This is not because you are incapable of dreaming expansively. It is because heaven's capacity for abundance exceeds every human capacity for imagination, and what heaven has in mind for your life is simply too large to fit inside any framework you could construct on your own. A purpose that has been quietly unfolding behind the scenes while you wondered whether anything was happening at all. During the waiting seasons. During the silent seasons. During the seasons when nothing visible appeared to be changing and the internal landscape felt stagnant and the evidence of forward movement was so sparse that it required a kind of faith that felt more like stubbornness than trust. During all of those seasons, something was happening. It was just happening underground, in the root systems rather than in the visible branches, in the preparation rather than in the performance. And what grows underground, slowly, painstakingly, invisibly, is always what sustains what eventually becomes visible. The journey is not over. In many ways, for all the ground you have covered and all the battles you have survived and all the lessons you have absorbed and all the growth that has already occurred, this is in many meaningful ways only beginning. The parts of your story that will be the most extraordinary, the most impactful, the most undeniably marked by the fingerprint of something greater than chance or coincidence or human effort alone, those parts are still ahead of you. They are being assembled. They are being arranged. They are being prepared with the same meticulous care and deliberate intentionality with which everything else in your journey has been overseen. And soon, those who doubted you will find themselves quieted by what they witness. Those who questioned your capabilities, who measured you by incomplete observations and arrived at conclusions that dramatically underestimated what you carry, will encounter a reality that makes their previous assessments impossible to maintain. Not because you will seek that vindication. Not because you will require their revised opinion in order to know your own worth. But because truth, when it arrives in its fullness, does not ask permission. It simply is. And it becomes impossible to argue with. Those who underestimated you will wonder, in the privacy of their own reflection, how they missed the signs. Because the signs were always there. They were present in your steadiness under pressure. They were present in your capacity for compassion when bitterness would have been understandable. They were present in the quality of your attention when you gave it to someone who needed it. They were present in the way you consistently chose to do the right thing even when the wrong thing would have been easier and less costly. They were present in the fact that you are still here, still trying, still believing, still carrying something that has refused to be extinguished despite everything that has been thrown against it. Those who walked away will realize, in the quiet of their own honest moments, that they once encountered something heaven had personally and specifically sent into their lives. Something that was not random. Something that was not accidental. Something that arrived in their path with intention and with purpose and with the potential to contribute something significant to their journey. And they will understand, in a way that will be both illuminating and sobering, that they were in the presence of something rare without recognizing it for what it was. And that understanding will teach them what they needed to learn. The secret that has been held in heaven's own heart, the full and extraordinary truth of who you are and what you carry and what you are destined to release into the world, is slowly, deliberately, lovingly being revealed. One layer at a time. One season at a time. With the same unhurried care that heaven has always brought to the unfolding of your life. Moving at the speed of wisdom rather than at the speed of urgency. Moving with the confidence of something that knows its own timing and trusts it completely. And heaven wants you to carry this with you, every day, in every season, through every circumstance that still lies ahead of you. You were never ordinary. You were never created to be ordinary, never equipped to be satisfied with ordinary, never truly at peace with the idea of a life lived only at the surface of what is possible. You were made for depth. You were made for meaning. You were made for something that outlasts the immediate and reaches into the permanent. You were never forgotten. Not in the silence. Not in the struggle. Not in the seasons of absolute darkness when forgetting seemed like the only explanation for the distance between where you stood and where you had hoped to be. Not for a single breath of your entire existence have you been outside of the awareness and the care of the presence that placed you here. And you were never walking this path alone. Not at the beginning, when the path was new and everything was uncertain. Not in the middle, where so much of the hardest navigation happened. Not now, as the terrain begins to shift in ways that suggest the arrival of something new. And not in whatever lies ahead, however unexpected, however challenging, however magnificent. You have been accompanied every step. You are accompanied right now, in this very moment, as these words find you exactly where you are. And the companionship that has watched over you this far will not abandon you at the threshold of the very thing it has been preparing you for all along. You are seen. You are known. You are loved with a love that was not earned and cannot be lost. And the best of your story is not behind you. It is rising.